The joke that I make about this, a lot of times the people who are fearful about, about this proposed ordinance that would simplify or reduce a lot of the zoning classifications, remove a lot of red tape, a lot of people are proposing that we're going to see this building bonanza of ugly buildings, right? Or there are bad buildings or unsightly buildings or whatever. And to me, what it reminds me of is the person that is afraid to lift weights because they don't want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger circa 1980, right? They don't want to look ripped, right? But it's like Arnold took many years and probably steroids, to get that physique, right? It's not something that just kind of accidentally happens with one little change. And so it's the same way with housing construction.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today's guest is Nolan Klouda, who is the director of the Center for Economic Development. The Center for Economic Development is a program at the University of Alaska Anchorage that promotes entrepreneurship, economic development planning, and research that provides potential policy solutions for mayors, assemblies, and legislators all across Alaska. Nolan Klouda was born and raised in Anchorage and left the state 20 years ago with no plan to return. Luckily for us, he did come back and has led the Center for Economic Development for the past 9 years. Today, we discuss Alaska housing issues, including the new municipal ordinance brought forward by Anchorage Assembly members Kevin Cross and Meg Zaletel that would simplify Anchorage's zoning code. AO 2023-66, as their proposal is known, will be up for public comment at the Anchorage Assembly meeting on Tuesday, July 25th. Note, during this episode, you will hear Nolan and myself refer to ISER. ISER stands for the Institute of Social and Economic Research, which is an organization also housed at the University of Alaska Anchorage, which helps determine public policy.
Well, Nolan Klouda, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up here in Anchorage, actually, mostly. I also spent some of my childhood in Kodiak Island, city of Kodiak and the village of Old Harbor, but primarily grew up here in Anchorage.
And I know you went to college in Kansas, right?
I went to Kansas, University of Kansas for my master's degree, public administration, and for my undergrad, I actually went to school in Minnesota, Gustavus Adolphus College.
Okay. So you made a conscious, you went to school in Minnesota and then in Kansas, and then you made a conscious decision to come back to Alaska?
Yeah, exactly. I was one of those people who thought, when I was a high school senior and I was about to leave the state, I'm like, this place is lame and I'm going somewhere else and I'm not coming back. But nothing like living in the flatland for a number of years to make you feel like you really miss Alaska, and so I was very happy to come back after a total of 8 years out of state.
What high school did you go to?
Went to Diamond High School.
And when did you graduate?
2002.
Okay, so 2002, you graduate from high school and you think, I'm going to get the heck out of here. I'm going to have a real life outside of provincial Alaska.
Yeah, kind of. A lot of times when you're that age, your hometown seems really boring and lame, and there's a whole world out there. And never mind the fact that I chose like the next coldest state in the country, Minnesota, and a small town too. So it's not like I was going to a big exciting city, but I still felt like you still sometimes feel when you're a kid in Alaska that the whole rest of the country is more sophisticated and cosmopolitan than where you grew up. And I think I probably thought that at that time.
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting twist. You go to Minnesota and Kansas, actually. So you didn't go to like New York City or
no.
Yeah.
And sometimes I wonder, like, why didn't I go somewhere, Southern California or somewhere that would have been fun and sunny or something like that. But these are choices you make when you're younger sometimes.
Do you remember why you didn't?
I think it was, I honestly liked the idea of the kind of campus experience that it was. It was a small campus and liberal arts college, and I was really interested in history and the humanities at the time, and the school kind of catered to that. And I was recruited there, so I seemed like the right fit for me at the time, and it was a good choice, I think. And then Kansas was actually more about a very specific graduate program in public administration that was geared around local government management, which was what I thought that I might want to do with my life at that point.
And what do you do with your life now?
So I direct the Center for Economic Development. That's a program at UAA here at the University of Alaska Anchorage. And the Center for Economic Development is just it's a really fun type of program to be leading. We're a small staff, currently 5, but we've been as high as 8 or 9 people. But we focus on promotion of entrepreneurship, helping people start businesses, also on planning, economic development planning, and then a third area that's applied research, and that's where, we talk about what are some issues that are going on in the state economy, what are some policy solutions to some of those things. And that's where I spend a lot of my time, doing public speaking or being an invited speaker, talking to policymakers a lot, state legislators, the Assembly, past mayoral administrations, both in Anchorage and then other local governments around the state too. People talking about some of the issues like housing or what's going on with the job market or some of these types of things that come up a lot.
And you took over as the director in 2014?
That's right, 2014.
So almost 10 years.
It flies by.
Yeah. Did you know when you were a Diamond High School grad in 2002 that this was the direction your life was going to take? I mean, it sounds like you had different ideas when you did your master's program. Mm-hmm. So I guess, can you talk us through a little bit about how one ends up as the director of the Center for Economic Development?
It's funny. It's not, I don't think when you're a kid, you even know that there's a thing out there called economic development. That's a pathway, a career pathway, potentially. A lot of things, a lot of the things that people do when they're adults for their careers are that way, right? That we don't even know that they exist when we're a kid, So I don't think I was one of those people that immediately knew what I was going to do. I think my wife is an architect, and I think that she knew when she was probably 14 or 15 that she was going to be an architect, and she did that and went through that, got that degree. She's an architect, and I was never one of those people who had my career mapped out that way. Always knew that I was interested in kind of the I thought maybe the political realm, the policy type of realm. Always interested in history and political science. Those were the majors that I took as an undergrad, but also really interested in some form, vaguely speaking, of public service, doing something that's good for the community. I was always motivated by that to a certain extent. And so I think after grad school, I got my master's degree in 2009, which was an absolutely horrible job market for all kinds of fields. And, local governments, I wanted to be a city manager, and local governments were all laying people off. We're all shedding jobs. And so I ended up working kind of odd jobs. I actually was a customer service representative for ACT, the folks who do the standardized testing. And so ended up doing that for a while in Iowa, of all places. But eventually, I'm like, I really want to be home. I miss home. And so I looked for whatever I could find in Alaska, and I, emailed around at the university. Eventually had someone who was willing to hire me where I am now at the Center for Economic Development. The director at that time, Christy Bell, still at the university in a different role. So hired me as a summer temp, and then got a permanent job, and then became associate director, and then director in a span of a few years. And so and then the 9 years just flew by.
So you mentioned that you do public speaking. Do you do teaching? I mean, I know because you're affiliated with university. I mean,
yeah,
are you like a university professor or no?
I'm actually not faculty, no. So okay. I don't teach any kind of regular credit courses. Often engaged in a guest speaking role, and we work with faculty on projects and things like that. But no, I don't teach any for-credit classes.
So really, you're paid by the university to research, discuss, promote economic development.
Yeah, that's a way you could put it. And also we are not really, a very small amount of our funding is actually general funding from the university. Most of our work is supported by external funding, federal sources like the Economic Development Administration and others. So we actually have to go out and get our own revenues to support the work that we do.
And last sort of dumb question, you're not part of ISER.
Oh, no, and it's not a dumb question. The Center for Economic Development actually was spun out of ISER many years ago, before I started there. So we actually were originally a part of ISER that was sort of doing work that was different enough that we were moved to a different administrative home in the university. We're under the UAA Business Enterprise Institute is the home for us now. But we still work closely with ISER on a lot of different projects.
It's funny for me because I interact, and I'm a new politician. My previous life was in healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is all new for me. And I was interacting with several economists, and I assumed that they were all working together. But actually, I mean, I've talked to you, I've talked to someone from ISER,
Mm-hmm.
I've talked to someone from the university, faculty at the university,
Right.
and y'all are all in Anchorage, all potentially kind of in the same neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
but really working for three different entities.
That's right. That's right. And we're all friends, and we all know each other and share notes all the time. But yeah, different places administratively in the university. I understand it's a completely perplexing thing from an outsider to understand, I guess.
Did you meet your wife outside of Alaska?
No, we met here in Alaska.
After you came back?
Yeah, well after I was here and established. We met in 2015.
Oh, okay.
So,
she's all Alaskan and committed to staying in Alaska.
She grew up in the military, so she's one of those people when she's asked where she's like, I'm from all over. I was born in Texas, but I lived in Italy and Germany and Washington and Virginia. Her family, her parents actually live here, decided to settle here after her dad was in the military, after his service ended. And so, yeah, we're very much long-termers in Alaska. We plan to stay here.
That's really good. I mean, I always sort of feel that out because, the fear is that the people who are doing great work and that we need the most are the ones who we have the greatest fear that they're going to leave next year. And
yeah, and that's how it goes often at the university. Especially, we've lost a lot of rock star faculty, and the ones who leave are the ones who have the best job prospects, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
They're some of the best faculty members, and it's a real shame.
Well, speaking of keeping people in Alaska, you are you're active on Twitter, which is great. And what I like is that you're willing to make statements. You're willing to you're willing to say what you really think, whether it's going to generate a lot of negative feedback or not.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. It's got both the highs and lows of what's possible on social media. It runs the spectrum, but it's an interesting platform, I think, for exchanging ideas and information. And that's what I like about it.
And so recently you have tweeted about housing and housing issues in Alaska and in Anchorage. And so I'm wondering, maybe you could just give us some of your high-level thoughts on the housing issues that Alaska is currently facing.
Yeah. Housing has been one of those issues. A few years ago, it was the labor market. I mean, we're still the labor market, but these big issues that end up being the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Like we can't talk about the well-being of our communities and our economic prospects without talking about housing, right? I think that we all see it. This is something that we all know that housing prices have really gone up, and that's a thing that's happened nationally. It's happened statewide. It's happened here in Anchorage. Is that housing prices went up, and there's a lot of reasons for that. During the pandemic, household savings rates went up. People had a lot of interest rates were low. People had a lot more mobility options to upgrade their housing or to buy a home for the first time if they were renting, and so this really pushed up housing prices. Everywhere. That what's different about Alaska and especially about Anchorage is that we didn't respond to that by building a lot more housing. Nationally, we saw a lot of homes starting to get built again in 2021 and 2022. Even as interest rates started going up, the market responds by building more housing. That's what should happen. But we don't really have a very functional housing market in most of Alaska, and we don't have one here in Anchorage, and we have very little housing getting built. The metric I like to use for it is for every 1,000 residents of a given place, how many houses are built, and nationally it's about 5 housing units are built for every 1,000 people. In the Matsu Valley, which is the place that really builds a lot of housing, it's about 7 units. Statewide, it's only a little over 2. Anchorage, just a little over 1 unit. So Anchorage has a real deficit of housing, a real drought of housing going on. There's just not a lot of housing getting built here at all, and it hasn't been for quite a few years. And that's something that really merits close attention. I don't think I have the complete answer for why that is, but I think it's a multitude of factors. We of course have a high cost of construction, but everywhere in the state has a high cost of construction that restrains how much housing gets built. We don't have a lot of, people say we're all out of land in Anchorage. I kind of say, well, maybe kind of. I mean, we have very low density development in Anchorage. We don't have necessarily vast green fields to be developed, but we probably do have a lot of redevelopment opportunities and some other infill type of opportunities. So I do think that probably one of the big things that we can control, and it's not the only thing, but one of the big things that we can control from a policy standpoint is some of our zoning and land use regulation. And I think that there's room for some reform there.
I use this statistic a lot when I was running for office and talking about housing, is that between 1970 and 1989, Anchorage built about 65,000 new homes. Mm-hmm. But in the past decade, we built about 4,500. Mm-hmm. So there's this, there was this period, this 20-year period. I mean, obviously that was the oil boom. There was a lot of folks moving up here. People had good paying jobs. But I'm curious, do you know, was cost of, I would think that the cost of construction in Alaska would be higher, period. Like it did, like in other words, it wasn't like we had really low cost of construction during the 80s and during the 70s and 80s.
Right. Yeah, I think of course construction costs kind of come and go up and down. They respond to various kinds of pressures from a market standpoint. There's a lot that affects it, but you're exactly right though. During the boom years when we're building a lot of housing, we were still a lot more expensive than the rest of the country. And if we're talking about now how a lot of homes are being built in the Mat-Su, the actual vertical cost of the construction itself isn't, appreciably different in the Mat-Su. There's some other stuff that, causes more cost to be here in Anchorage, but the actual construction effort itself isn't more, there. So that's kind of a constant. So we can't blame everything on that, right? Mm-hmm.
I would think, and again, going to your second point about land availability, well, I would say in the 70s and 80s, we probably had more land available because the houses hadn't been built there yet.
Right.
And something that comes up, and I haven't been able to quantify it, but there is a lot of talk about private institutions that own a lot of land. Alaska Mental Health Trust, right. The university, that these entities own a lot of land. It's not available for development, and that it looks like, so when you drive around, you see places, but maybe that land is not available for purchase and development. And I guess, do you know, like, is that a real concern, or is that just something that gets said?
Well, I don't know exactly all of the land availability and land market issues here in Anchorage, but I think that those are certainly some factors. That we also have areas of federal ownership, like the BLM area around the Campbell Airstrip, where it's not available because it's federal land. So there are, we're hemmed into the north by the J-Bear, by the military bases. So there are some factors like that sort of squeeze what's there. No question as far as that goes. But one thing that I would say is that one of the problems that zoning creates is that even if some of that land becomes available, it usually imposes density restrictions, right? Mm-hmm. So you need a minimum lot size, mm-hmm. and then you also have to have access roads, and you have to have driveways, and so you also zoning also usually puts a limit on how large of a home you can build on the given property. So a lot of our rules right now mandate a very low density format. So even mm-hmm. if some of that land becomes available to develop, we're only going to get so many housing units out of it. And that's one of the problems that I think that we have to really look at and be really smart about every available parcel that we end up being able to becomes available for development.
Well, it seems like the Anchorage Assembly is moving forward with a lot of changes to the zoning code to allow for higher density housing. And so it appears that we're moving in the right direction, I guess, would you say, in terms of allowing for more dense housing, getting rid of parking requirements, most recently an amendment to allow for higher, to build up higher.
Right.
Mm-hmm. A concern that was raised by another legislator is a fear that a lot of the talking points around the changing to zoning is that we want to create more pedestrian-friendly housing areas. We want people to be able to walk to a grocery store, or, do things outside, and that is not the way Anchorage has been built. It is not pedestrian-friendly at all. It's and that we can change things in a positive way by getting rid of some of the zoning code. The fear of this legislator is that the folks who live in the nicer areas, the higher income areas, the higher property value areas, aren't really going to go for this. And so when people start talking about we'll reshape the way downtown looks, the fear of that legislator is that South Addition isn't going to change. It's going to be Fairview and more of East Anchorage that's going to end up with these, much taller housing complexes without parking spaces, and I'll quote that legislator, but mandated bike parking for folks in East Anchorage who aren't going to be riding their bikes, but we're going to have this bike parking, no place for them to park their vehicles, and these tall buildings, and that's not that's not the image that the Assembly has in their mind as they're sort of stripping the zoning code. Do you think that legislator has a right to be concerned, or?
I think that some of those concerns are honestly kind of misplaced. The joke that I make about this, a lot of times the people who are fearful about, about this proposed ordinance that would simplify or reduce a lot of the zoning classifications, remove a lot of red tape, that a lot of people are proposing that we're going to see this building bonanza of ugly buildings, right? Or there are bad buildings or unsightly buildings or whatever. And to me, what it reminds me of is the person that is afraid to lift weights because they don't want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger circa 1980, right? They don't want to look ripped, right? But it's like Arnold took many years and probably steroids, to get that physique, right? It's not something that just kind of accidentally happens with one little change. And so it's the same way with housing construction. That scenario you're talking about, if we were to actually suddenly be building these enormous residential housing structures, we would have actually fixed the housing crisis probably or at least to some degree, right? We would be creating so much affordable housing that managing the creation of this massive surplus of affordable housing is the big challenge that we face. That's that's almost like the problem of I got so much money that now I have higher taxes, or it's like if we were to, first of all, we're not going to end up with that much of a building bonanza by making changes to zoning. I really don't think that that's likely to happen. We still have a lot of economic factors that make multifamily housing difficult. High rises are very costly format of construction. So I don't think that we're likely to see that type of thing develop at all. Regarding the parking minimum situation, where essentially, there's no longer parking minimums for new developments going forward. I think it's really good to remember that the developers who would be building the housing, they want their properties to be as saleable as possible, as marketable as possible. And so I think that getting rid of zoning minimums doesn't necessarily mean that nobody's ever going to build, or parking minimums doesn't mean that nobody's ever going to build parking. It means that the developer who has a better sense of the demand and the need is the one who's going to decide how much parking should be built. So I think that that's probably a better way to look at it. I really don't think that a lot of the scarier elements of that are going to play out. Now, the NIMBYism part of it, that South Addition is probably not going to allow it, or these nicer neighborhoods. That's certainly, I think that's probably the political dynamic that we're going to see. I've already seen some of these arguments on Twitter about people who are saying that they think that they're going to get a trailer park in the lot next door to them, or that there's going to be apartments springing up. I think those fears are also misplaced because, again, we have a lot of barriers to the profitable construction of new housing that aren't going to go away just with this one change. So those folks' concerns are probably not really that realistic. As far as building a lot of new housing in places like Fairview, in some ways, isn't that where we want to see more housing? Don't we want to see more affordable housing? Don't we want to see denser housing? And in Fairview, aren't we talking about an area that is relatively walkable or bikeable to commercial areas? So is Fairview not a good place to have denser housing that's affordable? I think it probably is. It's kind of turning the argument on its head. A lot of lower income areas, people that are lower income in Anchorage stand to benefit from the creation of more housing. But saying that we want to block housing to protect lower income people in Anchorage is an inversion of what's really happening.
Well, one thing about this came up when I was doing my talking points about all the construction we did in the 70s and 80s and how little construction we've had now. Mm-hmm. And if you talk to a realtor, what they will say is like, well, oh my gosh, we don't want to have what happened at the end of the 80s, mm-hmm. which was like, a total housing market crash. Like there was too many houses and they were selling for nothing, which of course, from my perspective today, I was like, what a great problem to have. Right. That our housing prices are too low. But when we talk about increasing the density in Fairview, but not increasing the density in South Addition, I'm just using those two neighborhoods mm-hmm. as examples in this particular, hypothetical. What we're doing is that we're increasing the supply of housing in Fairview, which will make housing in Fairview more affordable, whereas the houses in South Addition will continue to increase in value because, that'll still be the more desirable location to mm-hmm. live. And so the folks who own a home in South Addition will keep, increasing their wealth as the mm-hmm. years go by, whereas the folks in Fairview will be competing with all the new housing. And again, what a problem to have, but that their home values will go down, whereas South Addition won't. And that gets into the whole thing of like, everyone wants more housing, globally speaking, right. But they don't want the value of the home they own to go down.
Right. Nobody does. I think it's a lot of our net worth as individuals is tied up in home equity, right? I think that's an important nest egg for us. One thing that's worth keeping in mind is that if you start building a lot more housing and you create more affordability, you're probably not lowering the values of existing homes, especially not those higher end ones like in South Addition. What you are doing though is you're creating hopefully more housing at a variety of price points that more people can enter into. So that's a really important distinction. So the idea that we would build, say if an apartment did get built in the middle of South Addition, do everyone's home values tank? Probably not. That's very unlikely to happen. That's something that probably won't happen. So the fears about threats to home value usually aren't super reality based. It might slow the appreciation of your home, which has been kind of ridiculous. 20% in a couple of years. It might slow that a bit, but it's probably not going to cause your home value to go down.
The other fear that people have is like that 8 or 9 story building that's suddenly going to cast a shadow on, right. Their yard. That one comes up a lot. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Can you rest anyone's mind about that? Yeah,
the solar access issue. I wouldn't be too happy about a giant building casting a shadow on my home either. I think that where are we? But where are we talking about that happening? Do we really think that we're going to have a 10-story building in an existing single-family neighborhood? That's probably not what's going to happen. So I think that is this something that we have an argument that we deploy to stop any kind of construction mm-hmm. from happening because there might be a shadow that gets cast? I don't think that it's a super convincing argument. I can understand why there might be certain situations where that would be a concern. I don't think in the macro, perspective that is a major problem that we're likely to see affecting very many people.
Okay, I want to swing the pendulum in the complete opposite direction and talk about a stereotype that I had. So, I first came to Anchorage in 98, and I remember people talking about how unattractive Anchorage was as a big city. And part of it was just the strip mall, just all these strip malls everywhere. And it seemed like the neighborhoods, everything sort of south of downtown and the sprawl, this enormous sprawl with strip malls everywhere what people say is like, because we didn't have good zoning. We didn't have good zoning. And so we ended up with all these ugly strip malls and our neighborhoods all spread up haphazardly and that nothing makes sense. And so then when you hear the discussion that we're going to get rid of zoning, but you have this background early imprint that one of the reasons why Anchorage seems to not make that much sense is because we had bad zoning. I don't know. I mean, was that just all wrong? This whole fear that the reason why Anchorage is kind of, and maybe Anchorage isn't that unusual for its size or not, but that's just what people tell you.
So sprawl, zoning does not usually act against sprawl. Zoning encourages sprawl. And Anchorage has had zoning since, I think the first zoning ordinance was right after World War II. So Anchorage has had zoning since it was a pretty small town. That probably those early ones weren't especially onerous, but they were about minimum lot sizes and maximizing minimizing the amount of buildable space on lots. And so a lot of the way that Anchorage developed in that sprawling way was in line with what zoning required, actually. If we didn't have zoning, would it have been more dense or less? I'm not exactly sure, but zoning made it a requirement that we sprawled. So there's that argument off the top. I think regarding Anchorage does have a lot of unfortunate looking, especially commercial buildings, but some of the housing, it doesn't meet everyone's aesthetic standards, right? We got the Keep Anchorage Beige type of movement. I don't know why Anchorage developed that way. I think that there were some kind of bad design trends during the years when Anchorage was growing fast. We were growing really fast in the, like in the 70s and 80s. It was maybe not the height of architectural aesthetic standards. That's unfortunate. But I think that we don't necessarily want to be solving the problems of the 80s in the 2020s, right? And I think, and also you notice now that more of the commercial construction that's happened recently, some of the office buildings, there's the one that was the KeyBank building downtown. That's, nice, a really nice building, or the 188 Northern Lights, nice glass tower, very, very handsome looking building. That's just the market designing to different standards than it used to. But we didn't make these buildings nice because the design standards changed. We have more strict requirements for design standards on residential than we do on commercial, actually, in a lot of ways. And so that is so maybe some of these kinds of decisions, we don't need to have a top-down ruling about what things should look like. There probably are better aesthetic standards out there that the market will encourage on its own. I do believe that that's the case with housing as well as with commercial property now. So again, we don't want to solve yesterday's problems today. And also when people deploy these arguments as an argument against doing anything about housing, do we want to err on the side of of the current situation, which is strangling and causing lockout of housing markets and probably encouraging out-migration and harming our economic prospects? Do we want to err on the side of that, or on the side of there might be some buildings that you personally don't like getting built somewhere in your city? That's the question.
Something the Assembly did in the last couple of years was to allow for ADUs, accessory dwelling units, mother-in-law suites to be constructed on people's property. I had someone come in to my office a week ago, actually, to talk about their concern that so many ADUs that are being constructed are immediately being used as short-term rentals. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that if you went to Airbnb or VRBO, they would be bragging about how it was brand new construction. Mm-hmm. Like that. And so this person's concern was, if we were going to construct ADUs to sort of help with housing, it's not working because this particular person lives in Rogers Park and is like, there's a lot of new ADUs here, but they're all short-term rentals. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is that a real concern?
I can understand, not wanting to have a whole bunch of basically commercial lodging going on in your neighborhood. You've got more traffic impacts and stuff like that. I would say that if you are worried about those things or the impact of short-term rentals or Airbnb, in your neighborhood, the way to address that, there are lots of ways that policymakers can limit, Airbnb's impact, capping ownership. I think you proposed, right, the cap on.
I do. I'll talk about my bill.
Yeah. So there's stuff like that. There are ways that you can curb and limit short-term rentals. I don't think that the place to limit them is by stopping something from getting built. So that's one way to look at it. Will a lot of ADUs end up as short-term rentals under the current rules? Yeah, I think that they might. But will some of them also turn into longer-term housing? Yeah, also true. And there might even be a benefit to the idea of ADUs being built for short-term rental and taking some of the pressure off existing housing stock to be converted to short-term rental. So that's another aspect of this too. So that could be beneficial. So I think there's a couple different dimensions to that to that discussion.
So I'll mention my bill at first, and I'll just explain to you why. I mean, I did follow your Twitter thread that talked about how you didn't believe that short-term rentals were the driving factor in lack of affordable housing or in Anchorage. As somebody who really wanted to improve the supply of housing in Alaska and specifically in Anchorage, I looked at lots of options and I met with lots of folks. And the only one that I could find, the only legislative way that I could find that I might be able to improve the supply of housing very quickly, because any sort of incentivizing of new construction would take years. Right. Where it was like short-term rentals. And then this was, and it was actually an economist at ISER who pointed out that between 2000 and 2022, Anchorage added about 1,000 new hotel rooms. But then between 2019 and 2022, we added 1,200 short-term rental units. And so the argument is that short-term rental units are having an impact. They are the availability of them is increasing at an alarming frequency, and that we are hotelifying or making the hotelification of our existing housing market could have an effect. Now, I get it that it might be 1.5% or this very small percentage, but restoring even that small percentage to the housing market could have a valuable impact. And so that's kind of the intention of my bill. My bill had two parts. One was a registry, and that's just so that we would have better data. And then the second part, the more controversial part, was that a homeowner could only own one short-term rental. At first, I felt that was really going far. But as I mentioned to you just before we started, that Dallas City Council just outlawed short-term rentals outright. So it's possible to go further.
Right. Yeah. Well, so I'll take that. So this one, the Airbnb question, is one where I've kind of I've gotten disagreement from both the folks that are on the most anti short-term rental as well as those that are more pro, because I've kind of taken kind of a back seat of like I kind of want to understand better or know more about what the true impacts are. And so I'm not at all hostile to the viewpoint you're suggesting. In fact, I think it's probably a really sensible viewpoint. National studies do show that short-term rentals do have an impact on rental prices. So there is some amount of an impact there. It's not that it's not most of the rent increases that we've seen over the last few years, but it probably is a certain share of it. So I think that limiting the growth of short-term rentals is probably a really sensible idea. I don't go quite as far as banning them. I don't know if that's quite the way to go. But sometimes I push back, because I hear people I hear people suggest that short-term rentals are maybe the entire problem, or maybe that's all, they see these big increases in housing costs that have gone over the last few years, and they're like putting their finger on Airbnb as the main reason for that. And it's not that, but I do think that there's probably an influence there. And so I think that capping the number of units that an owner can have, like you're talking about, I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't like to see when somebody has somebody's listed as a host and they have 30 units here in Anchorage. I don't like to see that. That's not a good sign. That means that people are in this expansion mode, or they're wanting to buy up more property, and then we're going to see continuing growth. That is something that causes some real problems for us, and that I think we should try to curtail. Absolutely. So capping and placing limitations on short-term rentals is probably a good idea. I would say also that, here in Anchorage, maybe a factor. There are some smaller communities in the state. I mean, there are places like Girdwood, Talkeetna, Seward, some of these places where maybe 20% of their housing stock in a few cases is tied up in short-term rentals. I mean, that's causing some cost increases. There's no way that it isn't. So I think that that's also an important thing to mention too, is that it's going to have different impacts on different types of communities.
I'm glad you brought that up, that it's not just about Anchorage. You can go on Airbnb and find something in Nome right now.
Right.
I mean, like some of these really overcrowded spots in Alaska have short-term rental units available, which I think speaks to the fact that that some sort of statewide registry or whatever would be called for, particularly in a place like Alaska, in my opinion. But I want to talk about other things that we can do. Washington State housing. So Washington State legislature had 11 housing bills in 2023, which I don't know how many bills they passed total, but I would say that since we only did about 30 in our legislature, and we had 0 that were directly to do with housing, I'm guessing that the Washington State House passes a lot more legislation than we do. But I made this huge stack of papers. I made my staff print out all of the bills that Washington State had done to give me ideas for ways that we could potentially, as a legislature, contribute to increased housing construction throughout the state.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas?
Things we can do at the state level. I'm a big proponent of looking at making capital available for the construction of housing. And I think you and I have talked about this before, but something like the Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority, ADA, they have a program for commercial lending, not for housing, that stretches out loan terms, 20 or 25 years, I think. Most of the time, if I was to build a multifamily unit, I'd probably be looking at a 7 to 10 year loan, and that would really squeeze my cash flow and therefore, hurt my ROI. If I had a more source of patient capital, longer repayment terms, I might have a better ROI and be able to build a multifamily unit. So I think stuff like that is probably one approach that could be taken.
I think a lot of folks tend to think that that it's just terrible here and that's a complete disaster. But you look at like the price of an average home in San Francisco or rent in San Francisco. And then, where is that transition? If someone does not own, someone is homeless, how do you transition them when the price of a 1-bedroom apartment is $3,000 a month? I mean, there's just no way to step up that ladder. Things might look terrible in Anchorage, but they're not on that scale.
No, they're not. We're not among the very worst tier of cities, but we are, going the wrong direction, I think. And what's happened, nationally too, is that, places like San Francisco and LA, and they were always terrible on housing, right? For many, decades back, they were always terrible. But what's happened in the last several years is that kind of, extreme cost growth has really spread out to more and more and more of the U.S. And that's where we have these problems.
And I think what you hear from people on the other side of the aisle, at least, is that, the free market will take care of itself. And if the price of homes is too high and no one can afford them anymore, then the price of homes will fall. And that the government needs to take their hand off the scale.
There's a part of that argument that I don't agree with that argument in its entirety, but there is a part of that argument that is useful in this conversation and that makes an important point in this conversation, because there are, especially when we're, going back to zoning here in Anchorage, there are rules that we've made that do make housing more difficult. And it's very interesting to me to see, here in Anchorage and other places nationally, that the coalition of people, especially young people who are advocating for more housing development, the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard folks, they are a group that ranges from the very progressive voters to also a lot of conservative and kind of more libertarian type conservative folks that are saying the same thing, right?
Right.
And then the NIMBY groups, they run the whole political spectrum too. They might be everything from Trump supporters to Bernie Sanders voters that like their neighborhoods the way that they are. So I think that the politics of left and right here do get kind of short circuited in some ways.
We can even see that with the Zaletel cross
Absolutely.
legislation that the municipalities bring forward, is that, and I don't want to speak for them, but what I would say is that the more conservative argument is like, well, I should be able to do with my property what I want to do with my property.
Right.
And then the more progressive argument might be, well, we're going to do this so that we can bring down the cost of housing. We can have more affordable housing. We can, so two different goals, but using the same bill, and hopefully, getting a little bit of both in the end product.
Absolutely. I really commend, Kevin and Meg for working together on that. And to me, it makes perfect sense that you'd have a progressive and a conservative assembly member proposing that together. I'm glad that it rolled out that way. And I really give them a lot of credit for, embracing a bold proposal like that.
So we're getting towards the end of our time. As in your role, looking at all types of economic development, do you have any other big issues, right? I mean, we've talked about housing the whole time.
Sure,
is there another big issue that you're focusing on or working on right now?
Well, I think, housing is one of those things that really has come to dominate the conversation a lot lately. But other things that I'm really concerned about, things like childcare in Alaska. I think that we have some real problems with childcare. I think that a lot of our labor shortage types of issues that we have are in a lot of cases are I think made worse by the fact that we have a lot of out-migration. And I think the theme to what I've been thinking about, or what keeps me awake at night, is what is it that makes Alaska a good place to live? And I think that a lot of our economic opportunity stems from and is rooted in Alaska being a good place to live. And so this is what I mull over, and what I'm concerned a lot of times with is things like housing enable us to live here. It also encourages out-migration when we don't have enough housing, encourages in-migration when we have a good stock of affordable housing.
Last question we ask of our guests is if they have a book they'd like to recommend. Is there a book that you'd recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, there's one, since it's so top of mind, there's a book called Arbitrary Lines that I'm in the middle of reading right now by the author. His name is Nolan Gray, and I love the fact that it's another Nolan.
Nolan Klouda and
exactly.
Andrew Gray.
There we go. Oh yeah, perfect. It's like if we wrote a book together under a pseudonym or whatever. It's Arbitrary Lines, and it's about zoning, and it talks a lot about the history of zoning, zoning being used as in a lot of cases a measure of enforcing racial segregation, or of limiting multifamily development as being a lesser form of development that should be relegated to the industrial kind of fringes, and the ways that it's been zoning's been used to encourage more sprawl. A lot of the kinds of things that we don't like about the way cities developed in the U.S. Have to do with zoning requirements, and the federal government even sort of encouraging and mandating local governments to embrace zoning. So zoning's caused a lot of problems. I think the book gives a really good perspective on that.
Yeah, you know what I'm just going to say about the racial disparities and the effect of zoning on that issue. Mm-hmm. When I was talking through the Washington state legislation with my staff, the comment, there is a bill that was passed that was about addressing the history of housing discrimination due to racially restrictive policies. Yep. And they were like, yeah, but that doesn't apply in Anchorage. And I was like, I don't think that's correct. I mean, I think that we and I think it's come up before, specifically talking about redlining and Fairview, and that they're actually, I think, in this conversation, but I think that Anchorage is really emblematic of a lot of the lower 48, that we were not immune to those sorts of issues.
Oh, absolutely not. And I don't know, I can't speak to what was in the hearts of some of the decision makers when zoning decisions were made in decades past, but the effect of them is often to segregate, even right here in Anchorage. We look at some of our higher density, more diverse neighborhoods are the ones where we are the only places where we allowed multifamily to be built, and they are far away from where our nice single family neighborhoods are located. And I do believe that there was probably a racial element and motivation behind some of those decisions.
Well, Nolan Klouda, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Thank you to Maya Narong for making this podcast listenable, and thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com. That's eastanchoragebookclub, all one word, @gmail.com.